Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to 10 first albums to buy from the biggest bands. So I often get asked, what album should I buy if I'm trying to get into a band? If I have never listened to Rush, what would be the first album I should buy? And I think we're all going to have different ones that we might say it should be, but I think these are the ones that people should start with. And so we're going to do that. And if you're a fan like me, you probably already know all of these albums. So this is really intended for those newbies out there. But I will be doing a second video that is going to be called 10 second albums to buy from the biggest bands. And that's where we're going to start veering off into different territories. So keep an eye out for that. For now, we're going to get into 10 first albums to buy from the biggest bands. Before we do it, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by turning on notifications, hey, you'll stay up to date on everything going on in the world of music, just like this, with 10 first albums to buy from the biggest bands. All right, so first one up, and I'm going to be going through this by year of release. So this isn't, the first or the last or anything like that. We're not doing a ranking. We're simply going to go by year because every one of these albums is great and amazing. It's just which one should be the first one that you buy from these amazing big bands. First one up, Led Zeppelin 4, 1971, their fourth studio album. This one here has gone on to sell a whopping 23 million copies in the US. And yes, I will be talking about how much these albums have sold, and that is no reason or indicative nature as to why you should be buying them. It's just to put into perspective how big some of these albums are. This one here itself has gone on to sell over 37 million copies worldwide. And for this one here, the band really began to experiment using different arrangements. The album is essentially a greatest hits. It's one of those albums where all 8 songs have been played on the radio at different times. You've got Black Dog, Misty Mountain Hop, Going to California, and of course, the be-all, end-all of Led Zeppelin song, Stairway to Heaven. And for that one alone, this one here is probably the main reason why it should be your first album to buy from Led Zeppelin. But the fact that all of these songs get played on the radio means you will definitely not go wrong if you start with this one here. You are going to know something off of this album, and it will certainly be a great introduction. All right, next up, we're moving into 1973 for Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, their 8th studio album, having sold 15 million copies in the US and an estimated 45 million copies around the world. So just for the recording advancements that this album made alone, I think it warrants its inclusion in this list, but also in the fact that this album here has been the longest running album on the Billboard 200 album chart at this point at over 962 weeks long. I think sets it up as one of those first albums that everyone should be getting. It's beautiful, it's dark, it's spiritual, it's got some amazing guitar nuances by David Gilmour, who happens to be my favorite guitar player. You've got stellar standout tracks like Time, The Great Gig in the Sky, Money, and I have to say, quite possibly a perfect album if there ever was one, which is why I would make this your first purchase for Pink Floyd. Okay, moving on into 1976, Aerosmith rocks. You gotta have some Aerosmith in your collection. For me, this is the one to start with, their 4th studio album. It was the follow-up to their breakthrough album, Toys, in 1975, but I think this one here, which has gone on to sell 4 million copies, Toys has actually sold 7 million, but for me at least, this one here is a great place to start because of all the radio staples that are on this one. You've got Back in the Saddle, Last Child, Rats in the Cellar. That one there was an answer to the song itself, Toys in the Attic. I always thought that was kind of a cool tie-in there, but Nobody's Fault, which is another favorite of mine. And this album here is just simply a really consistent listen from start to finish on it. There's no lulls, there's no low points, no songs I want to skip on this one here, making it for me the best album for Aerosmith of the 70s and a great starting point for the band in general. Okay, next up, 1977. Can you guess what this one is? Of course you can. Fleetwood Mac, Rumours. This one here, 11th studio album, would go on to sell 20 million copies in the US alone. It is one of the biggest selling records of all time, making it one of those albums that you hear about, that's constantly talked about, that's debated on, and thereby an album that you should certainly start off with adding into your collection very early on, checking out Alone. It was the second album to feature Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks joining in. The previous self-titled album is where they started, but this one here, in my opinion, is truly a rock masterpiece in both sound and production on it. And despite the band members going through some really tumultuous times as they're starting to fall apart, remember, Lindsey Buckingham, Stevie Nicks were in a relationship, John McVie, Christine McVie were married, and their relationships are falling apart. This has some of the most amazing songs on it and creations. Of course, I guess it's conflict always leads to some of the best creativeness. And it's got some classic tracks on it like Dreams, sung by Stevie Nicks, Don't Stop, which is sung by Lindsey Buckingham, and Go Your Own Way, also by Lindsey Buckingham. This album, for me at least, I think sounds as fresh today as it did when, it was written, some 45 plus years ago, however long it's been. And so again, I think this is a great place to start because it's as fresh today as it was then. All right, next one. We're moving into 1978, Van Halen and their self-titled album, the debut studio album, which has sold 10 million copies in the US, hitting that famous diamond mark. One of the greatest debut albums of all time in and of itself. Just for that, it would be worth checking out. But it was also one of the biggest genre-shifting albums, moving from what was classic 70s guitar rock into what would become 80s rock and eventually glam metal, really spearheading that. But with that 1 minute and 42-second instrumental solo on here from Eddie Van Halen, it just redefined the guitar. So Eruption itself now considered to be one of the greatest guitar solos ever. Again, another reason for checking this album out here. But it's also got such amazing classics on it, like Running with the Devil, Ain't Talking About Love, my favorite Van Halen song, and then even showing you what they could do with cover songs on You Really Got Me, which I think they did better than the original song. That is very hard to do, but that's how good they were. So in all, just making this album a killer place to start. All right, as we move into 1980, AC/DC Back in Black, the seventh studio album, selling 25 million copies in the US with an estimated 50 million copies around the world. Another one of the biggest all-time selling records around the world. It was an amazing comeback album too. And so, when we sometimes, put aside the album sales and things like that, remember what this album was when it came out. It was a comeback album. It was following the death of Bon Scott, their previous vocalist. So this makes it a really great introduction into the band, not only for what they did at that time, but for where the band are today. You're going to go see the band, you're seeing them with Brian Johnson. That's who took over, and this is a great album to start with for something like that. You've got some of the most amazing guitar riffs from Malcolm Young on here. Maybe simple 3-chord blues rock, but it is also some of the best ever done. You got Brian Johnson, who accentuates every song on here, and then, of course, Angus Young, some of the most amazing lead work that he's ever done, and he's simply an unmatched guitar player in my opinion. You've got 3 of the biggest radio rock hits ever: Hell's Bells, Back in Black, You Shook Me All Night Long. This album here, chock full of radio hits. Another one of those ones where literally every song has been played on the radio one time or another, essentially making this one a greatest hits of AC/DC or a greatest hits of classic rock, even that, making it a killer place to start for an AC/DC album. All right, mentioned this one as an example up from the beginning. What's the first Rush album to start with? 1981's Moving Pictures, 8th studio album, selling 4 million copies in the US. So the album itself sort of melds the prog stylings of their earlier material with tighter, shorter musical structures. It was really adapting to the times that were going on, and that is why I think this is a key album for what they were able to do. It was a great album that would introduce so many people to Rush, myself included, making it a fantastic place to start. It's got mega radio hits, so new people coming into them who don't necessarily think they know anything probably do off of this album here. You got Tom Sawyer, Limelight, and one of the best all-time instrumental songs, YYZ, on here. So for me at least, it's a no-brainer. It's my favorite Rush album. This is why I would tell you it is a great album to start with for the band. All right, as we continue to move in through the 80s, 1983 brings us, yes, 90125, their 11th studio album. This one here, a significant lineup change, a significant sound change, a significant technical, song structure change. It's a lot of changes on this one here, but it also brought a lot of renewed interest into the band, reintroducing them to a whole new generation at the time. It was a mega album. It's their only number one album on the Billboard Hot 1, I don't know if it was a number one album, but it gave them a number one hit in the song Owner of a Lonely Heart on the Billboard Hot 100. So that would ultimately lead this album to sell 3 million copies, being their biggest album. But again, like I said, it also brought a lot of change, and it was very different from the old school stuff of the progressive 70s, having the shorter, poppier songs that are on here. So it kind of created a catch-22, but I'm going to be covering the more proggy era in the next episode of the 10 second albums to own from the biggest band. So stick around for that. Keep an eye out for that, where we will be doing that. So all of you people that were up in arms screaming when I pulled this one out as the place to start, I just think it's the most best place to start as an introduction to the band. But of course, there's other fantastic stuff within the Yes catalog. All right, where are we going to start if we were going to talk about a Bruce Springsteen album, Born in the USA from 1984, their 7th studio album. So this one here, while not really anything stylistically different or sounding any different than the earlier albums, it was a huge mega hit of an album where I think it was just the right place, the right time, going on to sell 17 million copies in the US alone, featuring 5 mega hits. And I truly mean mega hits off of this thing. Dance in the Dark went to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. Glory Days, number 5. Hometown, number 6. Cover Me, number 7. And the title track, Born in the USA, number 9, having 5 top 10 Billboard hits on one album. How could this not be the place to start? Yes, a lot of people cry, sell out, and so forth, but just because you have a big popular album doesn't mean it's a sellout. The material on here sounds just like a lot of his earlier stuff, and again, something I'll be covering completely different on the second albums to own by these artists. We'll talk about in that next episode. But this one here, the whole album is amazing. I think it makes a great place to introduce yourself to the boss. You get the biggest songs, but you also get absolutely no filler on this album. For me, a key thing with all these great albums, no filler. It's one of the reasons to start with these. Maybe there are other albums that have sold bigger, better, whatever, but I like a good album that is just fantastic from start to finish. This album being one of them. Same thing with this next album here, and the last one that we're going to be talking about, coming in for 1987, Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. Their debut album having sold 18 million copies in the US with an estimated 30 million copies around the world. It is the biggest all-time selling debut album, outselling Boston's debut album that currently sits, I believe, at 17 million copies. Another fantastic debut album that you could start with for a band. But this one here is the one I chose to go with. It is the dirtiest, sleaziest hard rock masterpiece ever, especially out of 80s rock. They blend classic Rolling Stones sounding material with the undertones of Aerosmith that we already talked about in here. Rolling Stones would be another one that we should have in this list somewhere, but you only got 10 slots. It just makes this one of the best rock albums ever. Every song on here is good. It's got 3 mega hits on here. Welcome to the Jungle, Paradise City, Sweet Child of Mine. But like AC/DC's Back in Black, every song has been played on the radio. The band has played every song live and continues to do so to this day at different shows, making a fantastic first album to start with by a band. This here, in and of itself, is a greatest hits from the band, but also a greatest hits from classic rock radio. Lots of these albums here are that way, which is why at least I'm choosing all 10 of these as the first albums to buy from these biggest bands. And as I said, so don't forget now, there's going to be a second episode called 10 second albums to buy from the biggest bands, where we will really start to veer off the path of those major albums that everyone knows. And then we can have a lot of fun with that. But hey, if you're new to rock and roll, if you're new to collecting music, I hope this episode helped you. If you're a longtime fan like myself who's been doing this for 35 years, maybe there was a shocker in there, like when I didn't go with Toys in the Attic from Aerosmith, or I didn't go with Highway to Hell from AC/DC, right? Who knows? Watch that second episode to see if those appear there, or hey, maybe I'll go a completely different direction. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.